Hello, fellow 655 students and Professor Steve Schatz. This is my reflection on curriculum design in our course with particular focus on activity theory and Christopher Alexander's pattern language. I know you asked for a 3-page paper, but this seems like a more in keeping with your own way of presenting, Dr. Schatz. So let me continue. Pattern language is a series of parts linked together, and the concept of a pattern language by Christopher Alexander is that depending on the context and what's going on, there are ways that make things work and other ways that don't. And he sought to figure out what is it about in architecture, the way objects are constructed and put together, that can live, that can actually be good, functional, and supportive ways. And I'm interested in how patterns of interaction with software and patterns of interaction with software in the context of instructional design work best. This has been a thread for me as I've been involved in the program, feeling the constraints of Blackboard, wanting to involve Google Apps. But there's another aspect of this that isn't so technical and is more just in terms of the patterns of a course. How much guidance, how much procedure do you give to students, how much freedom do you give to them, and what happens when you do one or the other. So an activity triangle is a way of looking at an activity and from that deducing what is required and what's involved. To me, it's an excellent bridge in analyzing interactions as if they were the kinds of architectural or fixed patterns that Christopher Alexander speaks of. Whereas he might diagram a fireplace, we who are doing patterns in interaction would use an activity triangle. And we use those in our group very much to do our curriculum development. And so part of my reflection is what I learned from that. So if you put pattern languages and activity triangles together, you get some similarities. The idea that you have a context and a problem and a solution. Both of these things are activity triangle and pattern language requirements. And the idea that there's some kind of conflict of forces that is resolved by finding the right pattern. Figuring out the right way to do a thing suddenly makes it work and feel good. And in our group at Designorama, we discovered a way of using Google Apps to make our curriculum design process work for us and feel good to us. So when we speak about a pattern, there are various elements that are required, and I developed my own description of the ePortfolio pattern because I kind of specialize and focus on ePortfolios using that list. And I'm just presenting this here as an example. You can pause the slide if you want to. But that was a global pattern, and when you start talking about more specific successor patterns, you need to actually start thinking about what tools you're going to use. So you don't have activity theory being applied at the course topic level. I can't say, well, what is it to be an effective manager? But I could say, well, what is the activity of being an effective manager as a head of a branch team in an insurance company trying to, support sales? So it's very, very important to get to the concrete in order to figure this stuff out. In this diagram, I'm talking about ePortfolios being defined by their purpose. Am I trying to archive something, illustrate something, showcase something, demonstrate something? And the audience, am I trying to do this for myself, for my peers, for a school, for colleges, maybe even for an employer? And as you can see, you have different kinds of portfolios depending on the purpose and audience. And if you can think about that, you'd have different kinds of software to be the showcase and development environments for those portfolios. We're not spending a whole lot of time on portfolios in this presentation, but I'm just giving it as an example. It would be better to spend the time using LMSs and things like that, and I'll get into that soon. Top-level portfolio patterns don't specify particular tasks and tools. Successor patterns do. There are different kinds of tools. Some are high context, like Blackboard, which are very much designed to do specific kinds of learning patterns without the learner needing to know how they work or having to configure everything. And low context tools like Google Apps for Education, where you can do many different kinds of things, but you really need to understand the system to figure out how those things work. And part of my work with schools is teaching teachers to know enough about Google Apps for Education that they can find the best patterns to do the kinds of things that are needed. At the ISD department at UMass, different professors have different levels of comfort moving beyond Moodle, or even with Moodle, to Google Apps and other things. And when they support students in making these kinds of moves and bringing in different technologies, I think a lot more learning can happen. But some students aren't very good at finding their own patterns, and so there's a sort of human side of support that says supporting students to share what's working for them and learn from each other, rather than require that the professor be the only person who knows how to do things and we have to follow what they say, which is old stuff. However, the instructional systems design is old stuff. It's a very specific process designed by Dick and Carey for a sort of behavioralist model, even though he has one chapter in which he says, oh, this isn't really behavioralist, I'm not buying it. And it leads to sort of rigid instructional models and rigid use of tools, which may be okay at the entry-level classes like 601, but when we start to get to application classes, rigidity doesn't create for creative and adaptive instructional designers. So I think you have a killer cocktail when you take traditional instructional systems design, which is a sort of rigid, prescribed behaviorist model, and a rigid LMS like Blackboard. Because Blackboard just feeds right back to the professor, oh yes, this is the way you do things. You take this and you boot it to this and boom, boom, and then the students have to follow those methods, and their students are supported in the inherited attitude of, what am I supposed to do, sir? Show me the right procedure, sir. I need to get an A, sir. And that really has, I don't think, any bearing on how well you perform in the world, because you know, you can get straight A's in school, but when it's time for you to respond to the environment you're in, there's no teacher to tell you what to do. Now, in terms of Google Apps, this is just a little diagram from a presentation that I do about it that shows how the patterns of Google Apps give you the ability to do very different things than the patterns of Microsoft Office. The old way is, as you can see with this first area, you have an artifact which you attach to an email. But the new way is that you have an artifact which you share with people and notify via email. And in this way, everyone's always looking at the top version of that artifact, and you can have a conversation on that artifact. Whereas with this way, each person has their own separate artifact. They do whatever they want, comment however, and then they send it back, and at some point the person who's the orchestrator has to merge everything together. There's even a higher level where you start involving Google Groups and comment threads, where you have conversations about the document and conversations about issues raised by the document. Anyway, this capacity to have shared documents and conversations around them, Designer-Rama made very good use of in our evolving curriculum design. So this is one of the resources I found by Goodyear talking about the use of pattern languages as a way of looking at curriculum design. And the quote here is really central for what I'm going to be talking about, the idea that we create a learn place, a series of tools and artifacts where learners work together. That learn place shouldn't, I'm proposing, be a LMS. It should be a lot more than that. And it says, and I'll read it aloud because I like this, one should not aim to design the learner's activity. One should design good learning tasks, but see these as resources the user uses in deciding what to do. The task does not prescribe the activity. Students will never do what we tell them, nor should they. Neither should we give them a blank canvas. So you see there's this, this tension between giving them enough that they can work, but not so much that they can't choose, that can't develop. We should try to create a supportive space of well-designed tools and artifacts while recognizing that students will configure their own personal learn place in ways we cannot predict. So here's how we used Google Apps in Designer-Rama. We began with Google Sheets. We took Steve's spreadsheet, but we made our own sheets, which, unlike Steve's, allowed us to do commenting and responding and changing and making new worksheets so that the same sheet could have many different worksheets where we're involving different things. At a certain point, I was losing a sense of how we were going to do this, and I said, well, let's make concrete examples for each of the competencies or topics that we were following on. Once we came up with concrete example activities, we could then apply activity triangles to then flesh out, well, gee, what's going to be required to be able to do these things well? And then Harry made this incredible activity triangle PowerPoint slide that allowed us to just very easily plug in the information, which was then easily imported into Google Slides, which is their version of PowerPoint. So now we were all able to collectively make these activity triangles together. I then created a Google form based on Steve's spreadsheet and adding other requirements like you putting in camp, which we then used to take the information from the activity triangles, put them into a form, and then merge that into a document, which would be a preliminary course design document for each of the courses, job aids or other things that are involved in our curriculum. So then now that we had those repositories of all the information that we had come up with about each of the topics, we could then move back into the other slides that we shared with you, where we had a timeline slide, a cover slide, and a detail slide. So that's how we work together. And I am now using exactly the same process with Ruth Ronan, doing a curriculum that she does with the professors at her college, and it's working beautifully. However, I wouldn't suggest that Steve go and take the process we came up with and say that students should follow it in future classes. First of all, there are things I know how to do to make this work that not everybody does. And second, some people might not like this model. You know, Ruth and I, maybe we think alike and we enjoy it. But back to pattern language. Christopher Alexander says that behind the choice of patterns are values. And his value, of course, is this idea of living, this idea that certain patterns are alive, certain places are alive, and that you want to design things that are alive. So Goodyear says that pedagogies and technologies of networked learning also have values. Sometimes those values are those old ISD values I described before that says, you know, the professor is in charge of everything that's supposed to happen. And the newer values, the constructivist values, say learners discover what happens because nothing actually exists, and this is straight from activity theory, outside the scope of the social as well as environmental context. And if you don't allow things to evolve with those contexts, they become irrelevant. So a procedure is a prescribed series of steps. Passive workers and passive learners expect to have procedures and to follow them, and that's kind of 601. A pattern is an evolved system of elements, and these can be expressed in steps, but go beyond that formulation. I can't follow a pattern just by following steps. I need to know how do those things relate together so that I can change them. Now, if you look at UMass's curriculum, which Ruth managed to find, it's very interesting. It's all there online for us if we want it in one of the wikis. They characterize the courses along the schema of IREIA, Introduction, Reinforcement, Emphasis, and Applied. And Steve is a specialist in Applied. All of his courses are A all the way across, whereas you go down to 601, it's all I, maybe a tiny little bit of E. So we're basically moving in, and you can see how that could relate to activity theory. It's a different kind of activity to apply knowledge to something than it is to be introduced to something. In 601, all we had to do was feed back what we were being taught in a test. But here we have to apply. So courses at the application level should favor pattern discovery over procedure following. And an instructional designer needs to ultimately be a pattern discoverer, not a procedure follower. So it's appropriate towards the end of our instructional design coursework that we are given courses that make us have to come up with and discover much more. So here's that spreadsheet I was describing before, where as you can see that Steve Schatz is all A, which is application, the red stuff. So I'm reflecting on 655 as a course in light of all this. It was low context. It was by Steve's design reflecting his values and style, which we know if we've taken more than one class of them, and the concept of an application course where we are empowered to discover, not tasked to perform. We were given the liberty to self-organize collaborative teams, figure out what roles we would play in them. We were given liberty to team organize our approach to the task. We weren't given a first you do this, then that, then that. Steve gave us a big mind map, but we didn't follow that. We were given a wide range of conceptual tools, all these readings, Brown and Cook and all those other folks. But we didn't have to just focus on one or just apply one. We could pick those that made a lot of sense to us. So, for example, I happen to really like the activity theory. I wanted to work more with that. And our learning was not defined by posting reading reflections, which is a sort of introduction level thing. It was, can we apply the readings and resources to curriculum design? The challenge is that it's very hard for a professor to keep abreast of all the divergent, evolving group patterns than it is to say, well, here's my procedure, did you follow them or not? It's harder to provide guidance and feedback to people involved in these evolving patterns when he isn't meeting with us when we meet. He isn't seeing everything that we're making. He's just getting a few things that we've produced. But he needs to be aware of what do those artifacts actually indicate about where we're at and what we're doing, because that's what he's really caring about. The artifacts themselves, It's not like they have some truth value that he's going to assess. Whereas if he had a process that everybody was following, all he'd have to do is check the submission and see, does it have what it's supposed to have? Until you get to the very end of something, you really don't know what things should look like. The problem with this is that students come to education with this mindset of having to follow the teacher's instructions in order to get an A, not finding their own path. And we really depend on our instructors to bless when we go outside of what's given to us. Yes, that's okay. Yes, you can do that. That's going to work. And for some students, not for me, but for some, they build up stress when they're not given enough feedback, when they're not given a sense that they are where they should be. And there are thresholds that are reached, which could either go the way I think Steve would like them to go, which is a breakthrough, or they can go to disengagement and a mind that stops grasping what's going on. And I imagine that that probably happened for some people. So it's very important, I think, the next time Steve runs this class, to conference with each individual group, not to have full class meetings, because it's with each individual group that he can get much more deeply into what's that group doing and how can he respond to them. Whereas with a full class meeting focused on what he's talking about, groups aren't able to get the contextual guidance that they need, and they're not going to give enough information to the full class meetings for that to happen, because that would be just taking up a lot of time. So that's my main suggestion for the next iteration of this class. And I'm going to just take again a reprise from that earlier slide. One should not design the learner activity, etc. You can read this yourself and pause it if you want to. There's much more to be said and much more to be discovered. Here are the resources that I used for this presentation. And if you do a Google for my name and Googling towards ePortfolios, you'll find a lot of stuff that I've written on how Google Apps can support patterns that are involved with ePortfolios, if you care about that. Okay, thanks for listening.